Warm welcome to all. I am Dr. C. Amida Selvi, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of Commerce, Self-Finance, VV Vaniya Perumal College for Women, Virudhunagar. In this video, I am going to share my ideas about overhead, allocation of overhead, apportionment of overhead, and classification of overhead. First, we have to know what is overhead. Overhead is the aggregate of indirect material cost, indirect wages, and indirect expenses. Aggregate means total. Total of indirect expenses are known as overhead. We should know what is direct, what is indirect. Direct expenses mean they are directly connected with the production activities. Indirect expenses means they are not directly connected with the production activities. The other names for overhead are overhead cost, overhead charges, non-productive cost, burden, loading, and on cost. The next term is allocation of overhead. It is the process of charging the full amount of overhead cost of a particular cost center. For example, salary of the sales manager is allocated to the sales department. Next term is apportionment. It means the process of distributing the overhead between cost centers on an equitable basis. Apportionment is the process of dividing the overhead, splitting the overhead between the cost centers. Cost centers means departments, between the departments on an equitable basis or suitable basis. For example, factory rent is to be shared by all the production departments and service departments on suitable basis. Here we have to understand what is a production department and what is a service department. Production department is involved in production activities. Service department is not involved in production activity, but it renders service to the production departments. Next, we are going to discuss about the classification of overhead. The overhead is classified under 5 bases. First one, nature. Second one, function. Third, variability. Fourth, normality. And fifth one, control. The first classification is on the basis of nature. Here, the overheads are classified under 3 types: indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. First one, indirect material. The cost of materials which cannot be allocated to a particular unit, a particular product, that is known as indirect material. Example, consumable stores, small tools for general use, lubricating oil, cotton waste, etc. The next one is indirect labor. It is otherwise known as indirect wages. These are the labor charges which cannot be allocated to a particular unit of cost. Example, salary of foreman, wages for maintenance workers. The third one is indirect expenses. These are the expenses incurred for business as a whole. Example, rent, insurance, taxes. Then the next classification is on the basis of function. Here the first one is manufacturing overhead. It is also known as works overhead, production overhead or factory overhead. It is the aggregate of indirect expenses of operating the manufacturing division of a concern. Example, rent of factory building, depreciation on factory plant and machinery. Next one is administrative overhead. It is otherwise known as office overhead. All office related expenses are come under this category. It includes the expenses of managerial functions like direction, planning and controlling. Planning means deciding in advance what to do, when to do, where to do and how to do. Example, office rent, office salary. Selling overhead. Selling overhead expenses are incurred in promoting the sales of a company. In promoting means in developing the sales, in increasing the sales. Example, advertisement, salesman commission. Next one is distribution overhead. These are the expenses pertaining to delivery of sold goods to the consumers. Example, warehouse rent, carriage outwards. Then the third classification is made on the basis of variability. Here there are two types. First one, fixed overhead. Second one, variable overhead. First one is fixed overhead. It remains fixed. It is constant. It does not vary with changes in the volume of output. Example, postage, stationery, salaries. When the production increases or decreases, the fixed overhead remains constant. Variable overhead. It tends to vary in direct proportion to changes in the volume of output. Direct proportion means when the production increases, the variable overhead also increases. When the production decreases, the variable overhead also decreases. Example, indirect material, power and fuel. Then the fourth classification is on the basis of normality. Here there are two types, normal overhead, abnormal overhead. Normal overhead. Normal overhead is expected to be incurred in attaining a given output. Normal overhead is unavoidable. Abnormal overhead. It is not expected. It is avoidable. Example, abnormal idle time, abnormal wastage. Idle time means the time wasted by the workers or the time for which the employer pays without any benefit to him. That is known as idle time. The next classification is on the basis of control. Here there are two types, controllable cost and uncontrollable cost. Controllable cost can be controlled by an efficient management. Example, idle time wastage. Uncontrollable cost cannot be controlled. Example, fixed cost. So far, we have discussed about the meaning of overhead, allocation of overhead, apportionment of overhead, and the classification of overhead. Thank you.